Bardzo mi miło powitać Was wszystkich w nowym roku.
I am pleased to welcome everyone in the new year and in the first event in our new year with the director of the Themikvah Museum from Barcelona, Ferran Barenblit, within the cycle of Curating Institutions that's been going on for 2 years. And together with the invited guests, we are thinking how art in its current condition and context is and should be political or critical, and whether it should be a subject in the processes as well as institutions that work with contemporary art. I would like to introduce our guests. Ferran Barenblit is the director of Themikvah. Before, he was the director of Centrum de Mayo in Madrid and Santa Monica, and also curator in the new museum in New York. He was a lecturer as well in many museums and universities all around the world. For example, Royal College of Art in London. The meeting will be moderated, and the discussion will be moderated after the presentation, before questions and answers, by Dr. Piotr Rypson, art historian, critic, and curator of an ongoing exhibition in the National Museum of Art in Warsaw, the Shouting Poland Independence 2018 exhibition, and also author of many books about art or design. Person who in the 90s was closely related with the Ujazdowski castle, because he initiated the Objekt magazine that is still being published nowadays. He was also a curator of the Ujazdowski castle collection and vice director of National Museum in Warsaw. I would like to say hello to the representatives of the Spanish embassy in Warsaw, who were so nice to and agreed to people whom I just mentioned from the embassy responsible for cultural matters. We are very pleased to have you with us. We do have interpreting, so you can take headphones to listen to a translation. And now I will pass the floor to our guests.
Okay. Press. It's okay? Okay. Buenas tardes. Good evening. Thanks so much, Margorzata, for the presentation. Thanks so much for the invitation. I mean, it's a real pleasure being here. So first of all, thanks so much. Thanks so much to Guillermo and Santiago for joining also in this evening, and all the friends in town, and to Piotr to be here also in this conversation. And I mean, it's great being here. I mean, to participate in this series of talks, because the question, I mean, the point of departure is particularly exciting. I mean, for a museum director, no? Is there still a chance that I mean, criticality is still a leading force of an art organization, of a cultural organization? Well, let's begin by the end. Yes, it is. I mean, now we'll discuss how. No, but it's completely. I mean, I think that any of us working in cultural institutions, I mean, if we go every morning to work, it's because I mean we do believe that that our critical activity and our critical voice is not only welcome but needed in society. I keep thinking that cultural organizations, especially museums, we work a bit like. Do you remember the butterfly effect? I mean, that part of the theory of chaos that says that the wings of a butterfly in one side of the planet can generate an earth and a tornado on the other side of the planet if they find the ways of the multiplying factors in the meantime. No? I think that museums operate the same way, no? And I'm sure that the next revolution will start in a museum, no? Or probably it has already started here today. No? At Ujazdowski. No? And here today, I mean, the next revolution has started, but we will never be able to demonstrate that it happened here because somebody saw something that led to something, and it was something commented, and that will generate an unstoppable movement towards a revolution. But for that to happen, we have to navigate in an extremely complex field. That on one side is obviously the public sphere, no? As that immense shared space in which we all operate, no? I mean, from a cultural institution and from every human activity, and on the other hand, I mean, we operate under circumstances that will always define our work, and circumstances that shape and influence each one of the decisions that we take in every single moment of our experience, especially considering that, I mean, cultural institutions are extremely fragile on one side. I mean, the smallest, again, going back to the idea of the butterfly, the smallest butterfly flight can affect the organization, because we are extremely fragile. We depend on symbolic values, we depend on symbolic elements, and we depend on other, I mean, more real, I mean, linked to the bureaucracy that governs us, to our formal governance than by our government bodies. We have obviously the finance as also a way in which organizations are constantly affected, but the way, I mean, we have to operate, obviously, and that complexity, it takes form also in a feeling which there's no one way of doing things right. I mean, there are many ways of doing it. I mean, I didn't listen to the translators while we were talking in Polish, but I don't know if you refer to my first boss, Marcia Tucker. Marcia, who was the only woman founding a museum in the United States, other than the Whitney Museum, and she was a curator. I mean, she was my first boss, and she told me, I mean, in museums, I mean, there's in most occasions there are many ways of doing the things right, and only one wrong. And if you avoid the wrong one, I mean, you have all the other options that make so extremely complex, I mean, the effect of the organization. And I will try to address that complexity today in this talk. First of all, for those of you who have not come to Barcelona, have not visited MACBA, I wanted just to show you some images of the organization for you to understand the museum. The museum is hosted in this beautiful Richard Meier building. I will talk about this. Opened in 1995, that's 23 years ago. Built right in the center of the city, in the old area, in a part of the old area that was, until quite recently, let's say until the museum was open, was an area that most local tried to avoid because it was associated to a kind of atmosphere linked to the harbor. I mean, it was called the Chinese neighborhood. Now it has a much more elegant name of Raval. But at that moment, it was the place where many obscure things happened, and it still is a part of town where there's a lot of tension. And in our immediate neighborhood, and always the local representative or political representative reminds me that the life expectancy in our neighborhood is 7 years lower than in the richer areas of town. So it still is an area that needs a lot of attention. And obviously the museum has been always seen as an activator of so many good changes, and also as a gentrificator agent. We have been, dealing with it with that fate since the museum was decided to be built there, and it was in a big part due to the decision of the architect, of Richard Meyer, who insisted that the museum had to be in the center of the city. The first option that the city had was in a much richer neighborhood, in a empty lot, one of the few. Barcelona is a very compact city, it's very dense, and one of the few empty spaces that could have been used for the museum. But he insisted in that location. I think that he was completely right, because then you have to think that both Barcelona and Magba also were places where some elements that now we think that they are more usual, such as gentrification, were rehearsed a bit earlier than in other cities. Barcelona has been a lab for so many urban strategies for I would say 40 years now. So this is the building. The building has a total of some 12,000 square meters, but only 4,000 are used for exhibitions. You can see how it's inserted in the narrow streets of the neighborhood. You can see it here. Also. Then it became. It would take me a long time to explain the whole situation of the museum, but it's inserted in an area that also had culture as one of the activators. Next to us, there's the Center for Contemporary Culture, CCCB, also a very active institution. Part of the University of Barcelona, the Art History School and other humanities schools are around us, and also only steps from us there's the major library in the city, plus the Opera House and many other cultural organizations. Some years after the museum opened, we got other buildings in the same plaza, including this building that you see on the left. That is where our archive, that is here, is, and also our library here. I will go quickly. And this is the atmosphere. It's a museum that both architecturally and also the program is a museum in black and white. We have very few colors. I'm talking both literally and metaphorically. We have very few colors in our program. We're a museum in black and white, and with this huge atrium. And this is another of the buildings that we manage. That just across the street is a Gothic chapel that is beautiful. Some of the installations we do here are great. It has an incredible acoustic, but it's very limited to what we can do inside. And this is it. And this is our auditorium, for you to have an idea of more or less what we are. I don't want to. This is the atrium in a moment of a public event. That is, this is one of the good uses of having a huge atrium. That was part, if you remember, a bit of what architecture was at that moment of the 80s and 90s when the museum was conceived. The atrium as a major space was extremely important. Probably now architects would not imagine such a huge atrium, but at the moment it was part of the signature of a building. I want to show you these images so you had an idea of more or less of visually what we are. But to explain the museum, I usually project this diagram because it helps me a lot to discuss what we have been asked to discuss today. The notion of the ability of a museum to be a critical institution, and it is because a museum is usually seen for everything that is on the right of this image. what we see on the right is what you actually can enjoy when you visit a museum. The exhibitions, the collection, the public programs, the education program, all of our digital presence, our website, and everything else that is digital. We work very hard in that everything that we do has to be digitalized. Our research and documentation center, that is quite important for us, with a very strong archive. Our publications that hopefully travel and can be available at the museum and outside, and also the services that the museum gives. Oops. And so everything on the right, as I was saying, it's about what you can see in the museum. Like, for example, exhibitions. I mean, the solo exhibitions that we have. This would be the whole list of all the exhibitions that we have done in these 23 years of life. I mean, this is for you to understand a bit to what, and then. And I don't want you to read. I mean, the group shows and the collection displays. But when talking about everything that's on the right, there's everything on the left. That is what you never see in the museum. But conditions and makes us. And give us the reason to take every single decision on the right, and for everything that we display, that we collect or we research, there's a reason on the left. And because on the left, I have included everything that the museum is. If at the right is what the museum does, and the left is what the museum is. And that's key to understand our critical role, and how can we actually be sure that we are doing and we are meeting the expectations that the audience, and not only the audience but the city and a global art context can have about us. No? So the first thing that comes to us is what defines us. No? To understand a bit of Themikvah, I have to explain what Themikvah, or how Themikvah was decided to be built and started in the 80s, in a moment in which things were happening very quickly in Barcelona, in all Spain. I mean, they were happening very, very quickly. And in that moment, the whole city was being reshaped with the new light of the democracy that arrived in Spain in the second part of the 70s. Themikvah was, I mean, the decision of building a museum of contemporary art was taken only a month after the Olympic nomination. The Olympic nomination was on October 17, 1986, and only a month later the museum is announced. So as part of this need of catching up with contemporaneity that the city and the whole country had. You have to understand that we have said many times that Spain had to quickly tune to contemporaneity. We probably skipped a good part of modernity, and we did. Our modernity was extremely brief, and we went directly from a pre-modern structure to a post-modern structure without an existing a clear modernity. And that happened, as I was saying, very quickly in the second part of the 70s, and especially in Barcelona in the 80s. At that moment, Barcelona needed all these projects. Many of them living with this idea of that became in a way part of the model that led the museum and was called for some time the Themikvah model. that had the idea that all the decisions had to be taken by consensus. I mean, decisions taken but only by only a part of the local forces were seen as negative. That culture was a way of progress, and that culture was a tool that had to illuminate, had to lead to another, to a next step. In many ways, and that was, I'm sure that it was not clear and it was not in the program at the moment, but it led to, as a part of a tool of a new neoliberal scheme of a generator of surplus value. But that was part. It was there. Maybe it was not in the moment that the decisions were taken in the 80s, but it was clearly included in how things were evolving during the 90s. The building of a museum was also the accumulation of a desire. In fact, it was not the first time that Barcelona had a museum. It had a museum of contemporary art during 1960, 1963, under Franco regime, until, I mean, practically the police closed it, because, I mean, it became even a dangerous place for them. And it was done, obviously, by the civil society. I mean, no public funds at all. But it was a moment in which the idea of that the city could have a museum of contemporary art under that name. That was quite early in history. And that a museum and a cultural institution could participate of urban renovation. Part of this idea of making a new program for a neighborhood, as I was telling, the neighborhood of Raval, including culture, with a signature building that became then in the later years of it became something that we could see everywhere in the world, that the signature building will be part of the project for a museum. I mean, a museum that, I mean, a new museum would always have to have a signature building that would be part, as I call the Mayor building, the piece number 0 in our collection, and that would generate a new urban culture. If any of you have come to the museum, you could see how, and this was mimicking also what happened in the Pompidou only some years earlier, how a new urban culture was developed around a museum. A museum that would address to a local narrative, addressing to what the city was going to be in the second part of the 20th century and in the forthcoming decades, because this is something very important for us. The museum was defined and imagined in 1986 as a museum of the second half of the 20th century. So that means that at this moment we have doubled our chronology. If at that moment we had like 36 years of history for the museum, now it's exactly twice as much, and that will still continue going. I think that's one of the big contradictions of the Contemporary Art Museum. And with a complex institutional context that make that the museum had to be inserted in a city with other organizations. It's a city that has a fine arts museum, the MENAC, the National Museum of Art in Catalonia. The three organizations founded by artists, that's something quite defining of Barcelona, and there's a fourth in Figueres, I mean the Dali Museum. But it's a museum it's a city that has the signature of three major organizations started by three artists, three male artists. I mean, obviously, I mean, we have to understand what's the art of the 20th century. But the first in doing so was Picasso, that gave his personal collection to the city as early as 1968. Then the Mira Foundation, that opened only a month before Franco died in October '75, and then the Tapis Foundation that opened in '89. But it's a city that has a very strong and very dense institutional context. It was also defined as a museum with an international scope. that was very important. To define the city. That because it was in a moment that the city wanted to be a global capital that generated multiple expectations. I keep comparing the museum to our national soccer team, that everybody has a plan and generate all the possible expectations, and everybody knows how to do it well, and that is what makes the museum such an intense and dense space of discussion. And we have to think also, I don't know if, but I imagine that this happens in more than one place in the world, that what we find in the local press much more than art critic is institution critic. No institutional critique, no, but critic of institutions. And that has something that has defined quite intensely, I could say, MACBA. This notion of the multiple expectations and the need for the museum to define its own path. That also generated histories of euphoria and deception. We have to be realistic, thinking that the museum has gone through a number of moments, of brilliant moments, and also moments of crisis. That were, I have to say that I added this branch this morning when reviewing this scheme, because it was quite linked to the directors. The museum have had 5 directors until now, 5 male directors again, something to be discussed at least, and it's true that each one of the directors have been visible by the decisions that we have taken, always quite conditioned by this, but all the elements that we are explaining here. There's something that I should say, that the governance of the museum, it's quite complex. I don't know if I have included the governance in some place here. Yes. Okay. No, that's our future of governance. Okay, let me briefly explain you our governance. Because our governance is defined by 3 public administrations and 1 private foundation. 4 political bodies in our General Council that has 24 seats, and the opening point of every single council is welcoming new members and acknowledging living members, because there are always changes. So it's a living body in itself, and it's a very interesting space because it's a political space in itself. Especially now that ideologies and the political parties and the ideologies they represent are very different for each one of the political bodies present. Especially now, I think it's a very interesting space because all the decisions taken there could be understood as a microcosm of the city itself. In the board, we have the city of Barcelona that has the presidency, the government of Catalonia, the regional government, and the Minister of Culture of the government of Spain. The three political bodies. Contradictory, the one that gives more money is the smaller. The city is the smallest. The minister is the smallest administration, but gives them the most money, and the minister is the biggest administration, but gives the less money to the organization, and they are represented by mostly by politicians or people that they appoint to represent them, that they obviously have their own voice. And plus a private foundation that is called the MACBA Foundation. That is not the museum itself, but it's part of its governance. And to understand that, I have to explain again what happened in the 80s. In the 80s, we were in a moment in which the politics of the city of Barcelona were defined by two forces. One was a bit more conservative, mild conservative and mild nationalist politicians. For them, the only moments of artistic glory could be the moments of political glory. That meant that in the case of Catalonia could only have interesting medieval art and never had modern art because it was not a strong capital in those years, but it was again an interesting place during the avant-garde, just because again the city was politically and economically visible in the global world. And so we had that force as one that had this kind of nostalgic view of culture. On the other hand, we had a social democrat force that was quite in the leading and shaping the city. I mean, if the other was leading the regional government, the other was the local force that was leading the city. That had another view of culture. That culture it was something, as I was explaining before, something useful that could make cities more attractive, and they were much more cosmopolitan. But on the other hand, they were much more frivolous as well. I mean, because they had this idea that culture was something that had mostly a use, no? And it was the moment that everybody read the same books and commented the same books, and if not, that they pretended they did so. No? So when these two forces had to solve each one of the elements of the city, they found solutions for everything. And when dealing with a museum, they thought, okay, how could we solve this? I mean, to which traditions do we have to address? I mean, to this nationalistic tradition that is very formal and attached to a way of understanding art that quite linked to, in the best of cases, to avant-garde, or the other was much more rooted in the conceptual tradition of local art. So, as they needed a referee, the private forces arrived. They also contributed with money, because the foundation raises the money to build our collection. That's the main goal. But they also bring two things that I think politicians could never bring, at least in our case. One is the long-term planning, because obviously business people work in businesses that plan very long time ahead, and they pretend they have been existing for decades, and they pretend to continue existing in the next decades, and they have a global scope. And that's part of the reason why MACBA is on that point, no? Because they brought these two very important ideas that made the museum, I think, a force where everything else could happen, everything else that I will explain now. So, as a result of all this complex governance and history, a way of looking at art has been developed in the 23 years of existence of the museum. All the ideas that you see on the screen, in fact, I think that, I mean, it was not that one day one of my predecessors took any of these decisions of developing these themes as the leading ideas for the museum, but they are the result of these 23 years of operation that I think is quite linked to the expectations and also the practices of a city. Maybe the main point is this idea of give a non-hegemonic reading of art history. That on one side is a very practical decision. I mean, it was very soon that the museum saw that we could never have the same collection than other big European museums. So we had to invent something different and look at art history from a different point of view. And it was the moment in which the reading and the main discourse of art was starting to be in trouble. It was the moment in which basically from, I would say, New York and Paris, I mean, the conventional art history was being posed as a question. So the idea of understanding a non-hegemonic art history, seen from the point of view of Barcelona, a Mediterranean city that looks at a very clear and very strategic geopolitical environment, it appeared as the way of understanding history. So what you see in our collection is not what you see in other collections, basically. It's true that part of what the museum built, it became a bit hegemonic in the later years. But that could be maybe more the effect rather than the cause of the building of the collection as such. It's also a museum quite focused in institutional practice itself. It became very quickly a theme for ourselves. In that I would include the institutional critique as part of the work of the museum, and that's quite clear since the very early moments of the museum practice. In a description and a narrative of art history built upon the notions of tensions. I mean, that's why I start with this idea of tension between informalism and constructivism, because that was what happened in the 50s. But that can be taken for the whole spectrum of the chronology that we treat. It's a museum based on tension. It's a museum that understands the history as a space in which tensions can be seen and are constantly expressed. A museum that questions the autonomy of art. I mean, that's very clear from, also from the beginning. I mean, it's a museum that has a very social understanding of what the museum is. Linked to a very local understanding of art also is a museum that questions the status of image, something that has been very important, I think, in the local narrative in a very clear way. I mean, it has been a theme, a local theme for decades. I mean, understanding what an image is and what representation is. You have to think that Spain still is a very Baroque country, a country based on representation. I think there are few museums in the world that you can see that more clearly than at the Prado Museum, that you basically, it's a museum of the representation of power. So the status of the image is still a very important theme, I would say, in Barcelona and in Spain. As part of this desire of being relevant socially, and this participation in the social sphere and the social debate as a way of progress. I mean, this has been extremely important in the museum from the beginning. The role of the audience as an activator. I mean, it has a museum that has always focused a lot in the audience, trying, maybe not always, achieving, but always trying to be an active audience that would generate a response. And then linked to the first point of the non-hegemonic art history, and then the narrative forgotten by conventional historiography, that it has been something that also in the last decades it has been more and more, and we try to have of decolonizing art history, but this has been one of the elements that made the museum from the beginning, and this rhizomatic idea that tries that the museum should be impacting and visible in a much broader space. As I have to start finishing this, let me go to what we understand as the elements that we want to include in in the next few years. So we have started in trying to include here. I mean, I could explain you about our strategy for the future. That it's that it's very important for us, and we are building all of our activity dealing with our strategy that we have drawn for ourselves. That has on one side the idea of focusing in the collection and not only in our activity and in the contents. But okay, this is what I wanted to show you. Okay. But that on one side, there's something linked to the need of keeping a museum contemporary, and that implies always thinking of what is the chronology that you have to address. And for me, that is trying to look at the art history as an evolving space that you have to follow, because if not, the museum will get stuck in a moment. When the museum was open in the 90s, it was very clear that the centrality of the discourse was in the 70s. In the, let's say, a space between 68 and 75, just to find very clear dates, in which conceptual art was extremely important, I would say, in Barcelona, Europe, and North America. And in a moment that it was in a very intense dialogue with the wish of changes that were happening at that moment. I think that very clearly, 20 years after opening a museum, you have to rethink where your centrality is, and without discussing the chronology, because we are not doing that. I mean, we want to be a museum of the second part of the 20th century. In fact, we are starting our collection in the 30s, in fact. But I think that you have always the need of bringing the centrality of the discourse closer to your moment. And for me, at this moment, those are the 90s. I think it's very different talking about the 90s here in Warsaw and talking in Spain for obvious reason. But for me, it's very clear that art history is activated in 20-year lapse, no? And that if in the 90s ideas could be developed, it was because they were looking at the older siblings of the 70s, and if artists now are doing what they do, is because they are looking at what was done in the 90s. So for me, it's quite important to keep the museum in this space. And then to this long list that you have seen here, I mean, those themes, I think that it's a moment that we could add also 3 more themes to our listing. One is the relationship between art and contemporary popular culture. That for me is extremely rich, and maybe, at least in the case of Spain, not enough researched. There's a very, and I think again that in the 90s, that becomes extremely clear of how does a space, particularly contemporary in popular music, and how this is developed as a space that has a very intense dialogue with visual arts. For example, I mean, I think a big part of the political agenda of visual arts, I think it has been rehearsed before in music. For example, when the relational aesthetics appear in the 90s, I mean, what they are addressing to is something that it was experimented in the 80s in music, and it's the point of the meeting point and the point of exchange. No, that at that moment the club culture represented, it became part of the lexicon of visual arts later. So for me, that is a very rich space. A second space that has to be with the body, with the human body, as something that needs to be reconsidered in all the political expansions. That's why our program focuses a lot in performance and performativity as a theme. And then a third theme that we are including more and more is the dysfunction of modernity in contemporaneity. This idea that I think that it's part of the effects of changing the focus of the centrality of the discourse from the 70s to the 90s. If in the 70s we would still think that the revolution was possible and that the utopian future was still something that we could dream of, after the 90s, I think that we knew that was not an option. That we have to rethink how we build our dreams, how to project our ideas of future, to rethink of a new way of building political futures for ourselves that will probably not be utopian, but much more practical. And because more and more we are debating of what happened with all the dreams of modernity. As I was saying, I mean, everything that is on the left has a projection on the right, and I will give you some examples on the right. And with this last samples that I gave you, for example, the idea of the importance of music and popular culture in visual arts is with the upcoming Christian Martley show that we will open in only a couple of months. We'll open a show with Christian Martley, who was one of those working in both fields in the 80s, from one side to the other very lately, or a show that will define a lot our action now. That is this show entitled Punk, that looked how the punk movement arrived in the second part of the 70s to stay, and is one of those words that you can still use of the 20th century vocabulary that is still a very powerful and a word that most people would like to be addressed as. I mean, I'm sure that most of you say I feel a bit punky, and I'm sure that we all feel like that. But the idea of the body as the space where most of these ideas take form could be seen from an exhibition that we had last winter with Rosemary Castoro, a painter, a minimalist conceptual painter, that the show focused in 15 years of her practice, but quite linked to the importance of dance in her life. She was a dancer, a performer herself, and how dance constituted a way of also of understanding painting, again, via the body, and with many other artists. And when we talk about the third idea of the dysfunction of modernity in contemporaneity, I could explain from a solo show with artist Domenech that rethinks of how architecture in the 20th century became from being utopian for being much more utilitarian and practical, and became a space in which also part of these deceptions of how we imagine that we could live in modernity, they were not as such. Or the exhibition that we have right now at the museum, that it's an exhibition called In the Open or in Stealth, curated by a group of artists from Delhi in India. I mean, called Rax Media Collective, that rather than thinking of the past, precisely project these ideas into the future. It's an exhibition that poses questions of how the future could be, in fact. And I will end by using their own way of understanding. They say they come from the future. They come from the future because they explained in a very quiet and harmonic evening in Barcelona. They say, imagine of Delhi. Delhi is a polluted city, with a chaotic traffic. Electricity goes off in summer when everybody's using it, and things are not easy. Be prepared, because that is the future. And I will end with another idea that they gave on the night of the opening that I really loved. That has to deal a lot with, because we have been talking about what, even when we know that what is an easy question to answer. The most important question is not what, but is how. In fact, if we take the program, the diagram like this of every single European museum, we mix them and we do random groups and again and create random organizations, we will still have consistent consistent programs. I mean, the programs of organizations are not that different. I think that what makes institutions different are not what they do, but how they do things, and how we take every single decision in how is our governance, how we want to express and exercise that critical capacities, and especially how we relate with audience. And this is and I will end with this idea precisely by Shuta, one of the three RACS members. He made a comparison with a part of the Quixote, in which Quixote writes a love letter to his loved Dulcinea. And after writing the letter, he delivers the letter to Sancho and says, "Okay, here is my letter for my lover. Please, give it to her." And he says, "Of course, master, I will do that, but where does she live? How will I find her?" Say, "Oh, I don't know. That's your business. I mean, my business was writing the love letter. Your business is delivering it." And I think that's part of, that's a bit of what happens in museums. I mean, artists, curators come to us writing love letters, and then they give it to us and say, "Okay, now it's your part to give it to the audience." Thank you.
That's a difficult moment now, because Ferran, you gave an overview of a very complex operation with complex mapping that goes together with it, and remaining at a very general, on a quite general level of discussing the institution, fortunately ending with the practicalities that you mentioned. So perhaps I should start. We are 1 hour in the meeting already, so I'll probably try to ask 2 or 3 questions, and then perhaps the audience would like to participate. And my first question would be a very, very pragmatic and practical thing. We are talking about critical institutions in most parts of the Western world, and probably the Center for Contemporary Art, considering itself a critical institution. Even the National Museum at a certain point was considering itself a critical institution. To what extent do you think this white, beautiful structure placed in the very old and dense surroundings in Barcelona defined its physicality and its urban placing, define in fact its position in thinking about itself as a critical tool within this social perimeter it's working?
Okay, if the question is about the impact in our immediate environment, I mean, an immediate being neighborhood, I think there are a few things that I think are more critical than that. I mean, because I think it's extremely difficult for a cultural organization to be significant in an ultra local space. I don't know if that's your experience for yourself, but in the case of MACBA, well, it's true that probably your immediate neighbors will never like you. I remember the first time I discovered that, I was extremely deceived. I mean, that happened not in this job, but in a previous job. And it was in CA2M, an art center in the outskirts of Madrid. And after some years, I remember meeting with some of the neighbors, but they were not very, very negative about us. But why don't you go someplace else? Because you don't belong to because it's true that an art organization does not belong to any particular space in the world. And I think that most cultural organizations have an issue to solve with the immediate environment. And immediate, I mean the 1 mile around you. And I remember this being the obsession when the Tate Modern was planned in the 90s. I remember listening to the people that were working, and they were mostly talking about the immediate neighborhood. And I asked myself, I mean, why? I mean, they are thinking of an organization that will have a global impact. I mean, why do they care about the first mile around it? But that was also one of the things, the critical things at the moment. And I think that's extremely difficult because it goes directly to the role of the cultural organization, and I would say of art. Dora Garcia, a Spanish artist, has one of her golden phrases, that in gold precisely, says something like, art is for everybody, but only an elite knows that.
Okay. And then if you could develop on the, you stress, there is a zillion things there, and probably twice as many as employees, which leads me also to another question: how do you manage the mapping of the organization with the staff that you employ, and how do you communicate the broad aspect of ideas? But I would try to stick to the practicalities for a moment. And you stress the participatory character of the audience impact, and also in the mission you address the issue of broadening and reaching out to diverse audiences. How do you actually do that?
Okay, I think there's not a unique answer of how you try to expand the audience and be significant. I mean, for them. I think that that's one basic idea, is that the cultural organization has to stop considering as a place where knowledge is transferred. Is that there's a difference between us, that we hold the knowledge, and the others that have no knowledge and come here to be educated. I mean, the idea of learning together, I think, is very important. And that, for me, if you ask me what is our strategy and what is the strategy that we have to follow, is the notion of the micro communities. I mean, there's no such thing as the audience. So the only way of creating an audience is creating multiple micro audiences, and creating micro communities in which people would feel a bit better. I mean, and try to do that by insisting in some formats that would make your audience or the people around you feel in a way that they are welcomed and where their participation is needed. The bigger the organization is, the more difficult that becomes. I mean, in my experience, that was much more possible in a smaller organization, where you could very clearly develop micro groups that would meet like every Wednesday and would generate a kind of activity and engage in some kind of contacts, and try to be, I mean, if we're all under the same roof, we will try to generate a space of contact that would allow that. I think that that's particularly possible with the public programs, because they are dialogical, and they break some expectations. You can make much more mistakes, I mean, and enjoy them, no? in the public program, and in spaces in which the experience is needed. The exhibitions are a bit more difficult, but it's still possible.
Is that a sustainable process in the sense that you create micro communities or micro audiences? And a museum traditionally is a promise of sustainability. It's something that you may think, even in very mobile environments, that you go there as a child and you also go there as an old person, right? So can you envision a process of sustainability with such a complex model?
I will explain one. For example, we took a decision in our strategy, this idea of focus on collection and generate a permanent display. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the ways. Until now, the collection of the museum was displayed as a series of temporary shows. And I think it was the good decision for the first decades of the museum. Yeah, because basically there was not a collection. But one of the things that we expect, we created this permanent display. If you see, if I go to the right again, I mean left and right constantly. I mean to the exhibitions and the collection. You have here all the collections done. All the collection displays done in these 23 years. And then this one I have marked with this yellow sign because we hope that it will be the last one. Mm-hmm. We called it the short century because, because it's the Hobsbawm a way of understanding the 20th century, but also because it's less than 100 years, obviously. But one of the ideas, there are many ideas here that I could explain for hours of how we address the collection, and I think that we took some strategies that are very useful. But one of them is trying to generate some emotional links with the audience. It's true that, I mean, we at museums, our expectation is that the audience will come to know more than to recognize. In Spanish, it works very well, but it's because it's conocer and reconocer. No? And we obviously don't want people to come just to recognize what they already knew, but we want them to learn and experience new things. I think that's key. I mean, we were talking before about tourism, and it's true that tourists, that obviously, I mean, I and I imagine everybody in this room visit more museums when you travel than when you are at home. Most times we go to museums not to recognize what we already know, and to know that what our expectations were true. In the case of Spain, it's very clear. I mean, tourists. Spain is a major touristic destination. Most tourists come to make sure that their expectation of the country is exactly and is still there. If you think most of the artists that has been successful in the global scene in Spain have depicted bullfighting, for example. Goya, Picasso, Almodóvar. I mean, Barcelona, they all have depicted bullfighting because that's expectation of a global audience, no? The torero. No? And but I think it's interesting to break expectations. I was asked in the job interview, I was asked, what will you do with tourists? I mean, break their expectations and give them what they have not came to look for. And I think that's very for all possible visitors. But then, even when I say this, I mean, and I say this as a contradiction, we do want to generate some emotional links with some pieces, and that's why. That's one of the many reasons why we think that a permanent display of the collection can help us to have stronger links with an audience.
And how many audience do you have a year? plus minus.
How many?
How many people visit the museum annually?
I mean, we have just given,
last year.
We have just given the number, so I remember very well, 331,000.
Okay, that's a good number. And
well, even when it's not, we are. Obviously, in town you have museums that are much more visited. I mean, the Picasso Museum has 900,000, and obviously 95% of them are tourists. And the Fine Arts Museum, they have also 800,000. We are a less visited museum than others in town. Mm-hmm.
And in being in this post neoliberal phase, what do the Board of Trustees say about that? Do they press, again, speaking of practicalities, on having such a complex map of ideas in the background and the program in the front? Do they press in a neoliberal sense that you should quadruple the amount of visitors and we'll give you more money for that?
Absolutely yes. Yeah. Well, we know that. The idea of society without politics is one of the dreams of neoliberalism. No? Of a society in which politics were not going to be needed any longer. That means that could be governed by statistics and numbers and figures. In that sense, but Bataille already said that. The headless space, with the space without a head, without intelligence, no? And in the museum, that means that the figures, the numbers, are extremely relevant, and the pressure of governance towards that is as strong with us as I think any other museum in Europe. But we have to resist. I'm sure we have to resist, even when, of course, we love people coming. That's a big contradiction, obviously, and that's like playing poker and winning.
Okay, one last thing. I have to congratulate the board and whoever was responsible for promoting you to the position. A man who has written in one of his keynote speeches at a conference, I think last year or 2 years ago in Lisbon, who said the museum should be a stone in the shoe. And something uncomfortable for those who visit us. Mm-hmm. And so my last question, and I will pass, I think, the mic to the audience, would be, it of course varies from city to city, even more than perhaps from country to country, but considering the level of uncomfortability that many contemporary societies experience in the public sphere, don't you think that the museum actually, there is a strong demand for a space that would be somehow liberated from the tensions that the media and politics of the public sphere offer us every hour and every second, and that this prescription, would you think, is valid for your particular institution and that particular city, or would you think it has a more general application?
If you mean by being a peaceful space in which tensions are not seen, I think that, that's as utopian as having that in the rest of society. I think we are in a key moment. We are in a moment of big decisions. I think that this happens in all Europe, in everywhere in the world, but especially in Europe. We are in a moment that we have to address to culture as a space of resistance. Resistance to an unstoppable need for spaces to be conquered. We know that reality is not owned by us. We have to win it every day from our enemy. And I think that we have to keep fighting. I'm fighting from that enemy to win every single inch of our space, and defining a broader space in which, I mean, our work could be really meaningful. I know it's a dream. I go back to the beginning of what I was saying. I mean, the next revolution would start in a museum, has started today here, no? But I mean, we'll never be able to demonstrate that.
Thank you, Ferran. I think it's a good time for questions from the audience or comments from the audience. I don't want to overtake the space. So is there anybody ready?
Yeah, hi. Is this on? Yeah, okay. Yeah, Ferran, I want to thank you, and indeed, I understand a bit better now that you gave us a bit of the mission history of MAGBA, why we got a regular call in New York from MAGBA, of all places in the world, representing and working, collaborating with a history that in New York, that was definitely a non-hegemonic narrative of the neo-avant-garde of New York, and there was a regular approach and interface and dialogue with MAGBA. And this is, so I understand this much better now after your presentation and the history. So to go back a little bit to, and actually to come back to Rosemary Castoro, this is a quite amazing story because this was one of the, in New York, overlooked women artists from the neo-avant-garde from the 60s. And the first retrospective of Castoro happened now in MAGBA in Barcelona and not in New York. So that's quite interesting. It shows like how progressive your approach is and how open and very, very much state-of-the-art. And very much in the course of the current most progressive discourse. To go back to the history of the beginnings, this is maybe a very specific question, but I find it quite interesting. You talked about your foundation, the MAGBA Foundation that's facilitating acquisitions in dialogue with the curatorial team. And when you started in the late 80s, I suppose with the history of Spain, that your political history and institutional and cultural history of Spain at the time, there wasn't, I suppose, much of a tradition or much of a structure for such a commitment from the private sector to support acquisitions in a museum like yours. So my question, I mean, I'm living here now since a year in Warsaw, so it's interesting to compare a little bit these histories, recent histories. How did it work that you got the commitment from the private sector to such a acquisition activity, to support the acquisition activity in such a scale at your museum?
Okay, I mean, it's true, talking about Castoro, it's true that, I mean, what we did with that exhibition, it's true. It's going to that mission of trying to see the art history from a non-hegemonic point of view. I mean, that's completely true, and hopefully we did a good job with that. No? But for example, some artists that now could be seen as not hegemonic, but I mean, with an hegemonic presence in the narrative of modern and contemporary art. I mean, when they had an exhibition at MAGBA, they were not that. I mean, that's why when Tanya Basson, our chief curator, arrived to the museum and said, "I want my first exhibition to be this artist that I didn't know." I say, "Well, okay, we are going in a good direction. No? If it's an artist I don't know, we're going in a good direction." No? So. And the participation of the private sector in MAGBA seems a kind of it's true that has been a defining element of the city of Barcelona that has not has not been the case of other Spanish towns. I mean, and more or less it's true that the local bourgeoisie always assumed that they had to arrive where the state couldn't arrive. In the case of MAGBA, I think it was one of those decisions taken in the 80s. And I have to say that they're extremely generous because some of the people that give the money to the museum, they don't even have a personal interest in contemporary art. They know, okay, we have to support the local museum, and they do that very generously. Mm-hmm. And that have also generated a long history of misunderstanding, urban legends. If you have the time, I mean, you can read. There's I mean, there's tons of that in the public space and in the internet. But it has made possible having a collection that was not the expected collection. And that's why, if you come and see now our permanent display, you could see how unique it is, because I mean it's divided in decades. We took a decision. We took many decisions in that, but one was the beginning of the collection. I think in every contemporary art museum, one of the most political decisions that you take is where is the beginning of your collection, because that defines a lot of how you see art history. I don't know how it's that organized in Poland. It would be interesting to know. I mean, how a museum of contemporary art defines that. Maybe 89 could be considered as the beginning of contemporaneity. The space has not always been clear. In fact, it's very interesting how in the 80s, before the Reina Sofia, the big national museum of modern and contemporary art was created, a law, but it's passed officially, defining what's the limit of the Prado Museum and the beginning of Reina Sofia. And it's very interesting how that line, that divide, is drawn in the year Picasso was born, 1881. Which is, I think, it makes the birth of Picasso the other significant birth in Western history. Because I can't think of another one, because of course the world was exactly the same before and after the day Picasso was born. He was a baby, not a genius. I could even understand the day Picasso paints this or that painting. Okay? But it's very strange that the birth of a baby, it becomes a divide. No? And in our case, the divide was the creation, it's a very long story, of Dawalset, that was the first artistic group in Barcelona after the Civil War in the late 40s. But that was a bit inconvenient for us. It was a difficult date. So we decided to move it to 1929. First of all, because we can. We have some works of the 30s that are great. We have two Calders that are beautiful. We have three Torres Garcia that are incredible. And we have bought and purchased an Annie Albers, so we could start the collection with a woman. I mean, the collection display starts with a woman. And then we made a prologue of 3 decades, 29, 59. 59 was the year that it meant a change in the Franco dictatorship. We will very long to explain here. And then we devote one room per decade. If we do this prologue of 3 decades in one, we do 1 room per decade. That each one of them could be a micro exhibition, because it's even thematic. There are some themes that link the whole display. That is one is how art and artists have reacted immediately to what was happening socially. Since the 30s, when the war arrived, and the artists are the first in the front line of images and discussion. No? And one of the most powerful elements that the Republic has is the 1937 pavilion in Paris. As the most powerful gun that could be used in a war is the propaganda, no? And in that case, international propaganda. And so how artists react immediately and how the city is a place where things happen. So that links the whole display. And each decade in fact, there are elements that each decade could change completely. We could do many displays of each decade, but they're very concentrated.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to go back to the topic that you touched already, the relations between MACBA and tourists. Can MACBA be critical towards this touristic traffic, or it maybe doesn't want to be critical? Or could you maybe say something more about the strategy of MACBA towards this traffic? And you said that 90% of guests in Picasso Museum are tourists. So do you count how many tourists come to your museum, and how do you do it? And do you somehow deal with it or discuss it?
So the question if we are critical towards
touristic traffic.
Okay, tourism. Okay, I think there's a big contradiction here. Yes, I completely agree, and because it's true that the European contemporary human is maybe a homo touristicus, no? Is people who travel. There's the popularization of tourism makes that it's more and more part of our society. I think the way of that. Yes, we do have all the numbers of the figures of tourists, and I don't blame on tourism. It's true that Barcelona has been an open discussion for the last 20 years of being an overexploited city for tourism. It was, again, a lab for other cities of how could they develop economically around tourism. And it's true that part of the reason, our mayor, presently our mayor Ada Colau, won the elections with an anti-touristic discourse. Even when we have again reached, obviously record figures, and I think it's very difficult to position in the space of tourism. I think that we should understand tourism in another way and try to use tourism for our goals. Because we have to recognize, I'm the first tourist. Today I was visiting, many places in the city, and how could we have an action, an anti-touristic action? Sometimes I do a joke that is, there's only, tourism brings the worst to any city. Real estate increases. Bars are not interesting any longer. In restaurants you eat, you don't eat as well, obviously, because tourists never come again. So you can just give bad food, so because the next day we'll have other tourists coming in their space. So it's true. Tourism brings bad things, but there's only one thing worse than having tourism, and it's not having it, because that means that you are not interesting. So I think that we have to deceive tourists, and give them what they are not looking for. And if they came, most tourists come to Barcelona thinking about our notion of genius. We had Picasso, we had Gaudí, we had Miró, and what happened if they find a museum that doesn't talk in those terms? That are terms that talks in a very political way of understanding, art as something that is in the public sphere, as a space of discussion, of intensity, and they find. And they find other things that maybe will change the way they understand, their own experience, and I think it's one of the few things that we could do. With tourism, that is use them to be on your side rather than on the major touristic trends, because if not, the war is lost. And that's why we don't have as many visitors as other places, of course, because they know that we will deceive them in a way. Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you also for your presentation. My question concerns non-hegemonic art history. Are there any parts of the world or any parts of Europe that you consider good partners in making non-hegemonic art history in your museum, by your museum? Or how do you imagine the geography of non-hegemonic art history today and your place on this map?
Okay, the way of understanding, the geostrategy of our collection, of our interest. At the beginning, as the museum was first conceived, it was quite what now we would say is conventional. That would be the North Atlantic axis, Western Europe and the East Coast of the United States. Then the next phase arrived with expansion both to Eastern Europe and then to Latin America at the same time. And then a next step will come with the Mediterranean and the Arab world. So I think that understanding where these views are being built now, I think we have many fronts. I haven't thought a lot about that. Maybe more our experience. For example, the show that we have now, that the show curated by Rax Media Collective, they are based in Delhi. And while installing the show, again, Shuda, the same that I mentioned before, that is one of the three members of the group, Shuda Bharata Sengupta, and he asked me, is this the first non-Western show that the museum organizes? He posed me a very difficult question. How non-Western? And then the next day he told me, "Oh, the question I posed you yesterday that you don't have an answer is because it's a very Western question. I mean, understanding that you have to divide the world upon Western and non-Western art." So I think that we have many fronts. I would say Asia for me is one of them. I mean, and now if you come to the museum, you would see the work of 30 artists, mostly from Asia, Africa, some European, that address some ideas that we couldn't even think of. That's why they insist that they come from the future. And they feel, and they think, and they say that they feel more and more at home when they come to Europe now, because more and more we're looking like India. So we're in good direction to arrive to the future. And I think that the other is looking to art history looking at some spaces that we have underlooked in the past. And I think that art history, as always, will be constantly being rewritten. And if that happened in Latin America in the last 20 years, and it happened also in this part of Europe also, I think that we have to be sure also that we don't act as those things that we don't want to replicate and to imitate, and not understanding the world as a globalized world that we have to conquer, using the same logics that the neoliberalism used to arrive to Africa or to many places where, I mean, that are seen as spaces where to make profit.
Any more questions? This is your last chance. Okay, Ferran, gracias. Thank you very much. It was a great talk, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you.